So to start off, we're looking at career and technical education in post-secondary institutions. Career and technical education is taught in high school as well as in post-secondary institutions, but in high school it's typically more of an elective class, something to give students a broad skill set as they go out into the world. But in post-secondary education, the expectation is that the students are going to be leaving the classroom and going directly into the workforce. So this is a critical transition period for students. What we started seeing in these classrooms is that the skills and the practices performed in the real world are often distilled down into these very small skill sets and set of tasks. And these skills and tasks often do not reflect the environment in which they'll be used. So that was our impetus for getting into CTE.
And actually, let me just, before I jump into the rest of the slide, I'm just here as a sidekick. This is really all sort of really Chris's work that we're going to talk about today. But we started having conversations a year and a half ago. And it started with some conversations in my office, and he started telling me about things that he was interested, a la what Jim was just explaining. I was like, oh, there were the things that he was describing that happens in CTE classrooms are exactly the things that we see happen in math classrooms at a university. Like it was a little eerie how similar things were that he was describing, and so that was sort of the real sort of jumping off point for this work. But I will say, and we've tried to. I was nagging Chris for the past week. I was like, we got to throw in some examples so people know what this work looks like, right? What is CTE? What does it look like? So we're going to try today to do a little bit of that. But I actually have some experience in this, believe it or not. Yes, I do know how to work on cars. I took a class in. I actually come from a long line of educators, and my uncle and my dad both taught automotive technology at high school. I took my uncle's class in high school for 2 semesters. Yeah. So when Chris and I have these conversations, right, when we talk about having to know a little bit about the content, the discipline, the domain, right, we were actually, it sort of, it took me a little bit to get back into it, but it really sort of helped to make that bridge between the work that I do in math and then knowing a little bit about like those the classrooms that we were observing in. So anyways, that was, I think, some relevant background. Anyway, so, Chris comes from the, background of CTE and sort of all of his experiences. And so what I bring is, and as I mentioned, I've done a lot of work in looking at math teacher educators. Specifically, these are university-based math teacher educators who work specifically with pre-service teachers. So that's a very particular sort of subpopulation of the bigger population of math teacher educators, when we use that phrase. And so I've done a lot of work with different folks, including, you might notice, Wenjin Lee, who's a former graduate of our program. She's still around and we're still collaborating. But a lot of the work was really trying to look at what math teacher educate, the knowledge that they bring to bear on their work, and the sort of different knowledge that MTEs with varied expertise bring to the classroom and when they're working with pre-service teachers. So, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Not unlike CTE instructors, math teacher educators, MTEs, they come from a variety of different backgrounds. You could have a research mathematician who's teaching a course for pre-service teachers. You could have someone who's a former teacher and maybe does professional development with practicing teachers who's teaching pre-service teachers. You could have someone like me who's kind of somewhere in between. But what that does is it's sort of the varied expertise that instructors bring gives us different kinds of insight into the different knowledge that these expertises that they draw on when they're doing their work in the classroom. So when we started having these conversations and talking about our interests and things that we've noticed in some of our own work and in Chris's experience, there were a lot of commonalities. So one was, we're both interested in courses that are designed for teaching learners, particularly novices, which we'll make that point a little bit later, novices who are going into a profession, a professional practice, right? So whether it's teaching, math teaching specifically, or whether it's going into automotive technology and working in a dealership, for example, right? So we're dealing with courses at institutions that are preparing them for a professional practice. And the teachers of these courses, which I just mentioned, come from a variety of different professional backgrounds. And we'll talk about how that's relevant in a little bit. And we also, as when we were talking, the kinds of what we'll call instructional moves that we were talking about, what we saw happening in these classrooms was eerily similar. And so we started coming up with these questions. Well, what is the role of, what are the different kinds of things that we see instructors doing? How similar or dissimilar is it? There was this sort of interesting sort of phenomenon of what we call, quote, stories, what sometimes gets called telling or war stories, which we won't talk a lot about today, but there were, these different kinds of stories being told, all for purposes of supporting content learning, right? And so that's sort of that's how we came to this work, and that's where we're at. But so maybe we can talk about a couple of examples. Actually, before I put that up, can I talk about mine? Okay. I'm sorry, I have a cough drop. So what we're trying to do is today we're not going to share, we're really going to share the examples from the CTE work as opposed to the math side, but I thought we could share some examples to kind of give you some, to help you get into the space. Because I was telling Chris, I always like to have people do math, right? And talk is a way to help them get into the space. So I was like, what can we do to get people into this space? So here we go. So this is our attempt. So you could imagine, so in some of the courses that, mathematics courses for pre-service teachers, some tasks that we might use would be samples of student errors, right? So we have an error of, there's a double-digit multiplication problem and the kid makes an error. So we're talking about a static written artifact. And so what I've seen, so you could imagine having students in the class, novices, learners, just kind of work through the problem and try and figure out what the error is, right? And that's sort of one route. But what we've seen in some of the math work is that what instructors do is not only do they have the students in the courses work through the problem and try and figure out the error, but we see a lot of instructors who are actually doing what we call modeling of the thinking processes that a teacher would do when they're faced with that error. So for example, I have an error, right? And so I'm talking through as the instructor, oh, well, I think the kid did this and he must not have understood place value because he didn't put the 0 here, right? And he shifted his numbers. He didn't shift his numbers correctly. So I'm thinking to myself, right, what does this tell me about what the kid understands about the multiplication algorithm? Well, I'm not sure, right? So I might think about another problem that's related that I could use to actually confirm whether or not this kid actually does have this misunderstanding that I think is happening. So we see exactly that kind of modeling, this sort of talk out loud about how a teacher might reason and make sense of a student error, and then the sort of subsequent work they might do, right, after they sort of look at the error. So that's an example from the math world. You want to talk through your example?
Yeah, sure. So one of the things the problems that we had in automotive was we kept telling students that the idea of gathering information and going through a diagnostic tree is very important, as well as understanding how the diagnostic tree works. This is an example of a diagnostic tree. It's very cookbook instructions. Here's how the vacuum test is performed. Is your result this? Yes, no, and you just keep moving on. But one of the problems that we had actually while working in another instructor's car was that the students ran through the diagnostic tree, and by step 4 they had to replace a computer, which was like a $1,000 part. And the students just stopped and we said, we can't do this, we don't know what to do. And what we eventually found out was that there was an aftermarket part on the car, and the diagnostic tree would have just kept looping them back and it never would have fixed the car. So what we see is we keep telling these students to go in and, this is really important, this is the Bible of how to fix a car. But then as soon as they get into it, it doesn't work. And so we then have to tell them how to adapt all that. So we start taking these kind of skills of collecting data and working through these things, and then we start actually incorporating them in how they're going to be used in the real world. So really quick, career and technical education, which since everybody has kind of been familiar with vocational education, I always thought people understood CTE, but it's far less understood than I imagine. But career and technical education is education geared towards jobs that require some post-secondary education, such as a certificate degree or an associate's degree, and results in a middle-income job. CTE comprises instruction in the academic, technical, and employability skills and knowledges required to enter into and succeed in specific occupations, and includes career pathways. These are kind of examples of large umbrellas areas. There's information technology, transportation, and business, and these are the jobs that you can expect to get after going through those pathways. Obviously today we're focusing on automotive technology. The coursework for these certificates or associate's degrees take place at two-year colleges, such as the city colleges here in Chicago, or a non-accredited institution, such as Coin DeVry or local unions. The non-accredited institutions are really important options for these students, because in Chicago, I think there's only one school for construction that's an accredited institution in the city colleges, and after that, it's Coin. I think it's the only other real option other than a union. So this is a large portion of the options available to these students. The certificates and the core classes in these programs can last anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, and after that, depending on the institution, if it's accredited or not especially, the general education requirements will go on from anywhere from like a month to 6 months. So in total, these certificates and degrees can range anywhere from 6 months to completion to 2.5 to 3 years.
So we threw up the second bullet. You'll notice the references from IES. So actually IES and NSF are paying increasing attention to research in this area of CTE. And I think just this year, so this is sort of IES's, I guess, definition of CTE that we took from an RFP, which from 2016. But the RFP was a request for proposals to put together a research network of institutions and organizations who are interested in CTE research. And they sort of gave the proposals, they wanted proposers, excuse me, to sort of focus on sort of two main strands, which was one, thinking about what are the knowledge and skills that students need to succeed in the professions when they leave education, and two, what's the nature of the teaching that we see? No, it wasn't specific about teaching, but it was, how can we improve learning outcomes? So my point is twofold, right? That increase these sort of, Department of Education, for example, is paying increasing attention to CTE. They actually just funded the research network that involves Vanderbilt and AIR to do this CTE work, to serve as a sort of research hub for CTE just this year. So that's one point. The other point is that what you don't see in descriptions of these calls for research in the area of CTE, what you don't see is any attention to the actual nature of instruction that happens in these courses. But in other domains, like in mathematics or even in history, we do care about the nature of instruction, right? So if we care about student learning outcomes, right, we need to also be paying attention to the nature of the teaching practice, and then sort of that's where we come into this place.
Yeah, naturally the focus around career and technical education increased. I think it was Chris Kennedy, the Democratic response to the State of the Union address last year. He filmed it inside of an automotive shop in a local school around there. So it's the idea of trying to promote these vocational programs. So when we started looking at this, we realized that learners need opportunities to engage in practices that are authentic to the domain, which can enhance learning outcomes, which Brown, Collin, Dugwig, I think is a great article for this, and Leighton Wenger obviously talk about this quite a bit. And the courses in both math and CTE domains often focus solely on the learning of the content with limited attention given to how the practices are used in actual professions.
Not my class.
Nor mine.
But it is, there's this sort of, long sort of, there's, at least in mathematics, there's a sort of long empirical sort of trail of, studies that show the nature of instruction in content courses for pre-service teachers. So mathematics courses, typically taught in departments of mathematics, don't have any connection to teaching practice at all. It's sort of taught devoid of practice. And similarly in CTE courses, they're often sort of dominated by lecture, right? And they might have a lab component, but it's largely lecture-based without any sort of connection to actual practice.
Yeah, and we use an example of medical education here, which is interesting in the next bullet point, because right around the time that vocational education was being taken out of the workplace and put into schools, medical education had a bit of a revolution where they began to realize that doctors learning solely in classrooms wasn't working, they needed to expand into practice. We saw studies that demonstrate ways in which instructors in other professional education courses provide opportunities for learners to engage in authentic practices. But in our own research and experiences in this domain, domains demonstrates that some instructors provide opportunities for learners to engage in authentic practices in the classroom, which we're going to show examples of later on. Ultimately, we need ways to describe the instructional moves that instructors use to connect domain learning and professional practice, so that we can establish a common vocabulary for understanding and studying teaching in order that we, in order to ultimately support instructors as part of a PT or teacher education. So, practice has been a bit of a challenging word for us to work with. So we've pulled from Lampert's definitions of practice. We focused on these two uses of it. Teaching is a collection of practices, such as asking open-ended questions, leading a whole class discussion, and the practice of teaching, which, for example, you can learn classroom management inside of a teacher education program, but classroom management is going to look different in different contexts. So it's kind of that idea of the thing in use in the context of which is you're going to actually be doing it. We're also interested in this idea of Grossman's degrees of authenticity. Grossman describes authenticity as the kinds of instructional interventions or instructional moves that professional educators use to help novices prepare for professional practice, and how these moves amplify or make more transparent relevant features of practice. So within the context of CTE, we're thinking about this as, in terms of the collection of practices, these are the skills that the students are going to be learning on how to fix a car. And the practice of teaching is the practice of being an automotive technician. It's taking these skills and using them in the profession. So the focus of our current work. Our aim is to leverage research on MT's practice and research on the nature of teaching and learning in CTE to understand teacher instructional moves in CTE courses. MTEs and CTE instructors are individuals who are primarily responsible for the preparation of these future professionals. There's not a robust program for apprenticeship for a lot of these students in the U.S., so it really does fall down to the instructors for this. We focus on the following research question: in what ways do instructors integrate authentic practices into their CTE courses? And so this is an idea, this is a framework we're working with, but this is to give an idea. This is the thing that we often see inside vocational classrooms, or career and technical education classrooms. This is the idea that the technician in the automotive classes, they come out of the profession. These teachers are often hired on their expertise based on time in the field. They're hired into the classroom, and then that's it. There's no formal education, there's not any ongoing professional development. And what you see happen is they often take their kind of domain knowledge and they bring it directly into the classroom without contextualizing it in any way. And this is more along the lines of what we want to see. So in this, what we're interested in seeing is how domain knowledge, how the CTE instructor takes the domain knowledge, kind of situates it in professional practice, and then connects all of that back into the classroom, the work done in the classroom. So to go back to Lampert's definitions, we're viewing teaching as a collection of practices equals that domain knowledge, and practice of teaching equals a professional practice. So again, those kind of small tasks are in that small circle, and they get situated within that larger circle and then pulled into the classroom entirely. These are some of the examples that you see in here. So some of the tasks that technicians need to do, need to gain are diagnosing skills, gathering information, testing, repairing, and knowing when to repair versus when to replace. So for example, instead of taking something apart and fixing whatever is internally wrong with it, you just take the whole part, get rid of it, get something new. And that's integrated into the professional practice. Some examples of that are customer interactions, time management, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. It's very important for this trade. 21st century skills and entrepreneurship, this idea of trying to find a niche within inside an organization. So this is Grossman's scale of authenticity, and on the far left side it focuses on less authentic. Fewer facets of practice highlighted, more narrow participation by novice, and greater opportunity for rehearsal. And then it kind of moves up into analyzing a written case, then going up into engaging in a live role play. And so if you're familiar with the problem-based learning work, when you start getting into these things, there's affordance of constraints in each one. When you're analyzing a written case, you're not in the situation. You have time to kind of step back and take a look and analyze things, so you have that space and that freedom to do that. When you engage in a live role play, you're taking some of the things that you learned while analyzing the case, and now you're in a live scenario. So now you begin to feel the stresses and the kind of time crunch involved with all that. So you're engaging in different things that are more attuned or more. They have more fidelity with the field for which they're planning on going into.
So hold on,
Yeah.
just one more thing. So the idea here is that, so this comes from Gross's work. You can imagine this is a spectrum of authenticity that would span a program, right? So in like an entire 3 to 4 year program in teacher education, for example, right? And the idea is that when you have novices who are first starting a program, you do want to be engaging them in authentic practices, but the work that they would do around representations of practice might be less authentic, right, early on in a program, but as you progress, as novices as they learn the sort of knowledge and skills, as they become, quote, more expert, then the ways in which you have novices engage with different representations of practice becomes more authentic, right? So we're not having students in our classes actually out in dealerships or out teaching kids, right, when they're in their first year of a program. So since they're not doing that, what are ways that we can think about how to provide opportunities for learners to engage in authentic practices, if that makes sense. And so we're sort of operating along this authenticity spectrum.
And again, for these automotive students specifically, they are going to be engaging in different practices as they go throughout the program. They're not just going to be in the classroom. They're going to be going into labs where they may be taking apart a certain component, and eventually they get into a shop where they're taking apart cars and that kind of thing. So I mean, they do engage in different scenarios as they go along. But what we're primarily focusing on here is the work that happens in the classroom while the teacher's instructing the students. To do this, we're pulling from the cognitive apprenticeship framework. The cognitive apprenticeship framework looks at methods of connecting types of knowledge required for expertise with learners. While we are not interested in learning per se, we are interested in the methods of promoting expertise. Specifically, we're interested in modeling. When you get to some of the lower methods like coaching, you're actually getting into doing the activity, whereas in modeling, the teacher's still in control, they're still at the front of the classroom, they're doing all the work, and they're beginning to model in different ways the kind of behaviors and knowledge and skills that they want students to pick up on. So,
Go.
So we went into, we did 5 classroom observations with 2 CTE instructors. We got 12 hours of instruction through videotape. We took field notes on this. We did some post-observation instructor interviews, collected teaching artifacts used during the instruction, such as task sheets was a big one in this class. The instructors had varied experiences. Instructor 1 had a master's degree in engineering and was a former dealership technician. Instructor 2 had an associate's degree in automotive technology, but then went on to own his own shop. So he sold the shop, or he wasn't working at the shop, he wasn't the owner anymore when he came back to teach. So yeah, this variation in instructor experience makes explicit different instructional moves and knowledge used from their teaching practice. You begin to see this experience inside of there.
I will say getting into these classrooms was very difficult. I think largely because we actually got kicked out at one point, but we surmised that it was because these programs have to be accredited, and we were in there videotaping. And we sort of surmised that they didn't want these videotapes, despite IRB, right? They didn't want these videotapes sort of surfacing out there in the world for fear that it might sort of interfere with any future accreditation processes that they'd have to go through. So that's what we hypothesized, but we don't know for sure. But it was actually very difficult. We went to multiple institutions, different kinds of places, and they were just, no.
Yeah.
So it was very difficult. You
I
think schools are hard. These were very, very challenging. Challenges I've never faced before.
I'm happy to announce for the first time to you too that we did possibly get a lead on another site.
Okay,
So,
there you go.
culinary institution. So. But anyways. So yeah.
Now you're done.
Oh, the other thing I was going to say about the accreditation too is that a lot of these programs too are not just accredited as in like the higher learning commission thing. But they're also additionally accredited by this institution called ASE, it's Automotive Service Excellence for Education, and they come in and they accredit the program based on the automotive standards. So they have these dual level of accrediting that they always have to deal with. So it's pretty tough for them.
So what did we do with our videotapes? We sort of made a log of the different classes that we had and tried to identify, so these are sort of 4-hour-long lecture classes is what we were observing. And so we tried to, make logs of what was happening within those different time segments. And then we use this sort of, it's a similar sort of approach to analysis that I've used in some of the math work, is sort of this top-down operating with a set of hypotheses about what we know about teaching and learning in these different domains, and also bottom-up in that we were actually looking at the video and sort of moving back and forth between what we know and what sort of research says, as well as what we were actually seeing in these videos. And so in looking, and so we would narrow down these different episodes, which took months, probably almost a year. But in parsing the data, right, when we had sort of identified the relevant episodes that we wanted to analyze, we were always thinking, all right, we needed some access to how instructors were reasoning about the instruction in that moment, right? So things like the different instructional artifacts that we were able to obtain, as well as interviews with instructors after the observation. And also, we had to understand the situated nature of the data. So what was the context of the class, right? The setting, the kinds of tasks that they were working on, or the lessons that they were working on relative to the sort of bigger program that they were within, things like that. And so it was a constant sort of back and forth in thinking about, in these episodes, what's the possible sort of pedagogical purpose of this move? What's the possible sort of domain purpose for this move? Sort of how does this move sort of make sense relative to the domain or the profession, okay? And so we both went through all the videotape independently, and then we would meet and sort of refine how we were thinking about these different moves that we were identifying, and sort of would resolve discrepancies over time. But again, it took a very long time to do just a few videos.
So the episodes that we focused on, and the examples we're going to show you, we're looking at modeling. And we're looking at modeling as a type of performance acted out or depicted by the instructor for students to observe behaviors or traits. They do this in terms of creating these hypotheticals or scenarios, and in one case a hypothetical scenario, of addressing complex situations that may occur within the professional practice. Authenticity we're looking at as an increase in both the task, as it more closely reflects the collection of practices the novice will engage in as part of their profession, and as that task is situated in professional practice. Again, if you're familiar with the PBL work, when they talk about fidelity and then they talk about authenticity, they're kind of gauging it as the fidelity of the task and then how realistic the situation is. Whereas we're kind of diverging from that. What we're really interested in is how well that task was situated inside of the activity. And we're viewing situation as connecting domain knowledge to professional practice. Additionally saying how or why it's related to the practice. Situating provides the novice a window into how the collection of practices look or may look in the profession, in the professional practice. So we've got 3 examples. So this is our first example, thank you. This is instructor 1. He's teaching a class on automotive climate control systems. In the clip we're about to see, the instructor is showing students an air conditioning.
ACs, air conditioners. Okay.
Yeah, air conditioning compressor.
Air conditioners.
He's gonna pick this air conditioning compressor up and he's gonna try to spin the clutch. And to try to explain that a little bit, the clutch on this compressor is attached to the internal components of the compressor, and the pulley on it spins freely. It's attached to a drive belt connected to the engine crank. So it's
keep going.
Really? Okay.
We couldn't bring one in, okay, to show you, but you'll see it in a minute.
Far less portable than math.
Yes, right?
So as the engine turns, it spins the pulley, but then as the compressor clutch engages, it locks the internal components up to the engine, gets the compressor to spin. So,
Right, okay.
We're good now. So the pulley spins freely until the clutch is engaged. So he's showing the compressor to the students, and he notices that the compressor clutch is seized when he tries to spin it.
We need to know that most of them they have a versatile to run the compressor, and they put a short iron, friendly, 3,000 words, and there's some kind of drawing, a Bible, and a citizen. And so we try to spin this document, which is short, but it is not spinning, so it was a clutch cut for some reason. But whatever it is, it's not spinning. I try to spin it. So that's it. Castro, we have to try that. Not able to spin, so we're using the definition of the rest of the working theory, but I'm not able to turn. For example, is that here? Your answer is very well. Right? And social and the Chinese are open, but they're dumb. Because it's very well, that's why I'm afraid some of the systems will not be able to join this clutched up because of the signal from not able to sub area and spin it out. That's another reason. So most likely when you unplug this, I will be able to spin the flash. All right.
So, in one sense, what he's doing is when he picks up the compressor, he begins to model something that's done by technicians on a regular basis. They're beginning to physically manipulate the component to determine its mechanical condition. So, in this case, it was seized, it wasn't moving, so that tells you something. If you turned it and you felt grinding, that could tell you something about the bearings. And so he is actually modeling a practice that technicians will use, but we're looking at this as low authenticity because while spinning the compressor does inform the technician of the mechanical state of the compressor, physically manipulating components, and it's a method that's used. But in this unlikely scenario, we're considering this an unlikely scenario because, first of all, the part's out of the car. Typically, a technician would get the car in whole, and they would have that compressor in the car, so you're not going to go spinning that component while it's hooked up to the car, so that's one problem. He is getting students to start thinking about diagnosing, which is something that they're going to engage in anytime they find a problem, so that's good. And he asks the students a few questions. But then kind of the solution to the problem is the fact that it has these shipping plugs still inside of the compressor. And so again, these students are not going to be dealing with the compressor that has shipping plugs inside of it. This is just not a typical problem.
What you see on that, what you don't see on the slides is what the students are sort of working through on the slides is just these are the components that make up this part, right? And this is how they fit together. But what the instructor's doing here is modeling this process of diagnosing, which was on some of our earlier slides, but that's not what the students are asked to do on the slides, right? The sort of what's on the slides is sort of here's a list of the components and how they fit together, right? And this is how the suction works and the different sort of forces that are involved. I don't know how to talk about some of this sometimes, sorry. But they're not, what's sort of on the slide and in the textbook is not for them to engage in this process of diagnosing around this particular component.
Can I ask you a question? Do they get into, or does he get into then the compressor as what its function is? That is, regardless of whether it spins, etc., what is the compressor doing or supposed to be doing as part of the AC?
Yeah, this was actually a 4-hour lecture.
Oh my God!
On exactly that question. I have a video if you're interested. But yes, he does, and he gets into long blow-ups, diagrams that show the internal components and how they function. And the students, I think, in this video, the students had in a previous class gone into a lab and been given compressors where they took them apart. So they do see that. One of the things that is also notably missing here is the customer entirely. I mean, in addition to not having the car, the customer is also missing this and that. If the customer came in and complained, they wouldn't be bringing in the compressor, right? And the complaints that they would have would be representing themselves in different ways. So if the compressor was seized, for example, the customer complaint could be something like, I hear my belt squealing, or the engine's shutting off, or there's a check engine light, something like that. So all of that is missing out of here. Yes, please.
Was that prompted by, was that planned, what this little clip that you showed us as part of his instruction?
So he had the cart out and he had them there, but at the different points that he went up, it didn't seem, either in the post interviews or from kind of watching the whole video, that anytime that he went over to the compressor, like that he had a cue, like, oh, at this point in my lecture I walk over and pick up the compressor. He kind of seemed to do it impromptu times. He'd be talking about something and then walk over and pick up the compressor. You could kind of see him talking and then realize, oh, this is something I could pick up the compressor and show. So, is that?
Yeah, well, so I think in some of the audio from the students, it sounded like they wanted to actually test sort of the reason why it was stuck. It seemed like there were some opportunities there for him to build out more of a model of how you would go about identifying, but then he didn't really seem to pick that up. So that's just what I'm wondering.
No, and again, and in this situation, especially, it'd be difficult to do that because it was such an inauthentic situation. So he wouldn't be able to take them through it, or he could talk them through it. But yeah, it would take a lot more setting up. Yeah.
So very closely related to that, because he had his back to us, it seemed like the students were interested in trying to figure this out.
Yeah.
And he was walking it around the room. Were they touching it or trying to at any point as he was walking around?
Not during that episode. In other episodes, you do see things get passed around, that kind of thing, but not so much when something has failed. At least not in these videos.
And I forgot, we had reiterated to ourselves several times yesterday, we wanted to preface the talk with, we're not concerned with what students are learning in these courses, right? But I think these are good questions, right? Like how do the students' questions sort of prompt a next sort of move, right? And so we do consider those, but we're not concerned with the nature of students' responses or what students are actually, what they might be learning in these classes. We're really just looking at what we can see and hear the teacher doing. And sometimes in relation to what the students say, but there was a lecture, so it was very little sort of back and forth with students.
We did also collect data on shop time and some of the other lab work that they did. We haven't analyzed that. We're really focusing just on the classroom for this, but yeah, they do engage in a bunch of other practices. Yeah.
I had a question about the shop time. How much in these kind of programs? How much of it is actually in a shop doing things in a really truly authentic way that they would do?
We'd have to parse out authentic. Because they're in a shop, and there are lifts, and there are the tools, and there are actual cars, and sometimes they'll bring in a student car that has an actual problem. So in that sense, they're actually working on a car that has failed. However, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later, the pay structure is in there, which is a big incentivizer for how you work on cars. The customers aren't there. There's no promise time. You're not engaging with the parts department. So it's authentic in one sense in that they're actually doing the work of a technician, but they're not doing it in the situation that the technician would be doing it in. It's a very low stakes, which is good for the student. It's a good opportunity, right? Like they don't have the pressures and they don't have to worry about things. If they break apart, it doesn't come out of their paycheck, that sort of thing. But they don't have those stresses in those shops. So it's authentic on one level, but not.
But they still pose the technical problem of this is something that could happen in real life, and I have to take a car apart to fix it.
Sometimes, yeah. So, I got two more examples. In the second example, Instructor 1 begins to situate the collection of practices in the professional practice a little bit. In this case, he's reading from a bullet point from a slide provided by the textbook that's associated with the class. Sorry, I've been having some difficulty with the audio, so I may have to skip back once in a while. So, that's what he did.
That's the most likely. They have flavor, they have crop, they have roman all the time, and therefore we might have to replace all flavors. Even though sometimes it's not visible, it takes some time to look at job, and in all dealerships, instead of trying to rebuild or fix the compressor and failure, replace the nozzle, oftentimes we replace the whole assembly.
So here he's creating a scenario to explain the impetus for replacing the seals. However, as he continues, he begins to provide some more details related to professional practice. Notably, he says it takes time and then immediately shifts to the practices inside the dealership. There is a direct correlation between time and the work that's done in these dealerships. So the way technicians are paid is every job pays a certain book hour or a time. So for example, an oil change pays a half an hour. If it takes you 10 minutes, you get paid a half an hour. If it takes you 2 days, you get paid a half an hour. So depending on the kind of shop you're in, this plays a significant role in the work that you're going to be doing. In a smaller kind of corner shop, because they're expected to be a little bit less expensive, they may go ahead and do the kind of work that he was talking about with replacing the seals because it takes more time, but it's also significantly cheaper, and that's what the customers there are looking for. At the dealership, customers are paying a little bit more, often the car's under warranty, so those aren't really concerned. So in a dealership setting, you're just going to be replacing the part, you're not going to be taking it apart. So he doesn't make the connection between time and the dealership explicitly, but he brings up the issue of time. He says this takes time, and then says in a dealership, this is the way you're going to handle this. So we're beginning to see some increasing authenticity here. So making repairs to the air conditioning system is a practice that automotive technicians would engage in. The methods of repair would vary based on the type of shop the repair is being done in. These different shops all value time, right? But they do it in different ways. So he's beginning to connect these tasks to the practice that they're going to go into. So it's a little bit more authentic. Now here's the third example, and this is instructor 2. He's teaching an introductory class in automotive technology, and in this particular chapter they're talking about, as you can see, fasteners such as nuts, bolts, and washers. It's an entire lecture on nuts, bolts, and
4 hours on nuts, bolts, and washers. No joke.
This was a slog of an analysis, especially if you've been through it, which I have. So yeah.
No judgments though, we're not trying to advise you.
So at this part of the program, yeah, they're being introduced to this. And specifically right here, what he's just done is he just got done introducing them to something called a helicoil. And what a helicoil is, it's a little thread repair kit. And what happens typically is you take out a spark plug, the threads will often strip away as you're taking out the spark plug, and then you're left with this big hole that you can't rethread because it'll be too big for the spark plug. So you take this thread insert and put it into the hole. So that's what a helicoil is. And he's just got done kind of informing the customer. Before I play it, I want to note what he has on the PowerPoint slide. It's very minimal. It's very bare. There's not much up here. It just says thread restorers and chasers. This is what they are. This is what they do. And here's chasers. And here's how he talks about it.
The pay for this, it's not free. It costs. You think you're going to spend 2 hours restoring a thread for free? Now you can do it for free if you don't know your responsibility. If you know your job, the customer pays for it. How? I'll tell you how. An average man will last how many thousand miles before it is? 80 to 90,000 miles. Was it like that 20 years ago? No. 20 years ago, 30,000 miles would have been stopped with a tune-up. We said it dies, and 10,000 miles would have been stopped with a tune-up. Now we have spark plug that can go 90,000 miles, right? 1,500, 1,800, 1,000. Okay? Temperature goes up and down. You buy your car, your temperature goes down to 0. You start getting an average driver cover how many miles per year? You guys drive it, you tell me. 4,000. Okay, divide that by 90. How many years is that? To go 90,000 miles. So you're going to be driving a car with one safe route for 7 years, and one day you're going to bring the car to me for a tune-up. And I'm going to tell you where that spark will act. And the trade will be shared, right? I'm going to be responsible. What do you guys you don't inform the customer, if you don't explain to the customer, you end up with the first time when they ask, after that, when the vehicle I ask you, oh, what can you do a truck? Oh, truck? All the time. What do you mean? You do the spark plug? You don't actually the spark plug, no. That's not the explain. Well, the spark plug can last time it bangs out on mine. Yes. Then that's how I talk about the tray. Being aware to the scenario. And I'll explain the implication. There are chances that anytime I try to put this problem out, I might lose the tray. And you're going to end up with a new tray. And this just explain the customer, okay?
So, in this clip, he's providing a richly detailed scenario and pointing to a number of contributing factors that influence the technician's thinking, as well as the actions the technician needs to take to address those factors. Notably, the instructor says, if you don't know your responsibility, pointing to the role the technician is expected to perform in servicing, or taking a collection of practices and utilizing them in a professional practice. And so, we saw this as a really high level of authenticity. The instructor is modeling a number of things for the students. He's pointing to he points to the car, the condition of the car, as well as the condition the car would have been exposed to prior to the technician getting the car. He points to the kinds of communication and miscommunication that occurs in live scenarios, and he points to the fiscal responsibilities of the technician. He also points to when and how to address these issues to avoid irresponsibility. This is a level of authenticity not reached in the first two examples. The hypothetical scenario is rich in details, salient to the collection of practices that technicians would engage in with their profession, and situated within the practices of the profession by explicitly connecting the collection of practices to the practice of the profession. So, our takeaways from this work: we want to be able to connect students to the workplace. Since the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917 pulled learners out of the workplace and put them into the classroom, this was born out of a technical rationality that we now know is not enough to prepare learners for the complex world of work or the 21st century workplace. While the classroom has advantages over the workplace, notably in allowing students to learn in a low-stakes environment and removing all the power hierarchy present in a workplace that disincentivizes the transmission of knowledge, as talked about by Lev and Wenger, more can be done to connect professional practice to the collection of practices learners must acquire. And this is where our work comes in conducting empirical studies on the ways in which the teachers do connect professional practices to the classroom learning. So, yeah, in lieu of a stable and robust apprenticeship programs, this learning does take place in the classroom. So we're hoping to inform, through understanding these practices a little bit better, to inform the design of PD, by understanding the work that's currently being done by the teachers. So in the future, we're hoping to bring this lens to various lab, hands-on activities in the settings. Like I said, we did collect some data in the shops, which is really exciting. And it's a really complex and rich environment, both to analyze and also to film in and do kind of any work in, because there's so much activity taking place. And we're looking to expand into other CTE fields, like I mentioned, such as culinary arts.
Chicago's full of these places,
Yeah.
right? It's full of all these sort of organizations that prepare professionals for these different sort of CTE fields.
Yeah, some of them are actually very tucked away. Coin Institute, by the way, is on State Street, right above the old Carson Perry Scott. You wouldn't notice it, it's not well identified. But yeah, then eventually I would like to conduct comparative case studies involving NPEs and CTE instructors. So, thank you.